Good morning, everybody. We're going to get started now. So my name is Dan Adams, and I'm the cannabis reporter at the Boston Globe. And this is actually my first time in Los Angeles, so it feels a little strange to say this, but welcome to Los Angeles. And I want to thank the organizers for choosing this venue. I obviously came from Boston. It was 22 degrees when I got on the plane. And so we're in good shape here. And this is definitely where people are supposed to live. I'm not a scientist, but I think the data is pretty clear. But more importantly than Los Angeles, I'm here to welcome you to the 2019 North American Cannabis Summit, presented by Advocates for Human Potential in partnership with the California Department of Public Health, the Canadian Center on Substance Abuse and Addiction, the Tobacco-Related Disease Research Program, and the UCLA Integrated Substance Abuse Programs. And if we could just give a round of applause for our partners and all the sponsors who made this possible. Thank you. So I'm going to tell you a little bit about the event that we have going on over the next 3 days, and I'm also going to tell you a little bit about myself, which is going to be easy ground for me to cover because, the reason I was so eager to participate in this is because the values of this summit really mirror my values as a reporter. And so what we're looking at here is objectivity, neutrality, inclusion and representation, earnest, productive discussion, and an open-minded exchange of ideas and perspectives based on the belief that good policy stands on good science. No political posturing, no profit motive, and as long as you behave yourselves, no name calling. So it's appropriate that we have convened here in California because this state has been at the forefront of marijuana policy for decades now. So what better place to have the definitive conversation about its future? And I'm going to be frank, this is an extremely ambitious conference. There's no other event like this, but it's exactly the one that we need. Because here in California, just like in my home state of Massachusetts, the conversation among real stakeholders is turning from this long-running debate over whether to legalize cannabis to a more nuanced conversation about how we legalize cannabis. We're talking about who will profit, how will businesses be regulated, where will they be located, how do we maximize opportunity for disenfranchised communities while also minimizing harm. And yes, both those goals concern equity. What does science tell us about the drug and the products derived from it? About the impacts of legalization, about consumer behavior, about which prevention messages really connect, and which ones just sound like the DARE officer who put me to sleep in 5th grade. How are medical professionals being educated or not about cannabis? What is the appropriate role of federal, state, and local governments? These are the questions we're going to be exploring this week. And these can be difficult conversations. They're a lot more difficult than merely checking off yes or no on a ballot question behind that curtain. But they're necessary conversations. And so it's to that end that we've gathered more than 150 highly qualified experts from Canada, Mexico, and the United States. Experts who represent a staggeringly diverse array of perspectives and fields within cannabis. And that's the part of this that actually really excites me the most because in my experience as a reporter, you learn the most when you get out of your comfort zone, when you go to a community to which you don't necessarily belong, with your ears and your minds open. And so my request of you is, rather than grumbling about the leanings and perspectives of those with whom we disagree, let's engage. With all these people in the room, I feel like if you don't meet an unexpected new potential collaborator, if you don't have your assumptions challenged, if you don't learn something this week, I mean, maybe you forgot to take off your earplugs after you got off the plane. Because we're really going to get into the substance of this. And I think that the national and international conversation about marijuana will be better off for doing so. So our goal is no less than that. A little bit about myself. The conversations I just described are actually some of the same conversations that my publication, the Boston Globe, has been trying to uplift with our new marijuana section, which I helped create after first jumping on this beat in 2016. And I had actually previously covered the alcohol industry. So if anyone here wants to geek out about the 3-tier system when I get off stage, we can do that. I'm your guy. And I'm pretty sure I'm the only one of my friends who knows what the TTB is. So. Now, look, on an average day, the mainstream media, at best, offers us pun-laden, lighthearted marijuana news. I'm sure that you've all seen this type of coverage, right? Moms are apparently replacing Cabernet with cannabis at their book club meetings. Sounds fun. Denver is the mile-high city. And if any of the reporters covering this summit use the phrase, up in smoke when you write about it, I'm going to track you down. So these stories are silly, that's true, but they're actually a step forward from decades of really terrible coverage of cannabis that focused beyond all proportion on the assertions and assumptions of what we in the news business call officialdom, meaning law enforcement, government, and yes, institutions. And these stories might, in their individuality, have been objectively true. Dan was arrested with 10 pounds of marijuana at 123 Main Street. And that may have been true. But taken together, this coverage emphasized only the danger and the criminality of cannabis. And in my opinion, they poisoned our conversation and they marginalized real people affected by these policies. And so just as many of you are doing in your own fields, we're trying to change and improve how the press covers cannabis. We're trying to turn the page on the debate over the weather of legalization. Over the weather of legalization, because as of 2016, at least in Massachusetts, that's settled law. And so the real questions that people were asking, well, first of all, they were asking when the marijuana stores were going to open. I had strangers accosting me on the street about every other day about that, distant relatives and strangers writing to me about that. And yes, we covered that. The first stores opened in Massachusetts on November 20th, if you care. But more importantly, we pushed our readers to have a better, deeper, more respectful, more inclusive conversation about cannabis. For example, we talk about consumers rather than users. And yes, we actually talk to them. And no, we don't portray advocates as scruffy, fringe stoners because they're not. They have a real seat at the table. They're key stakeholders in the Massachusetts policy discussion. And in a minute, I'm going to introduce you to a longtime advocate who's actually now regulated this industry in Massachusetts. And in particular, our coverage is focused on the question of equity and our state's struggle to craft policies within the legalization framework that acknowledge the deeply racist history of the war on drugs in this country. And in doing so, we've been very intentional about reaching out to communities whose voices were for a really long time excluded from this conversation, people who were talked about, not listened to. Now, this is not activism masquerading as journalism. This is about giving voice to the voiceless and applying long overdue skepticism to officialdom, both of which, in my opinion, are core responsibilities of good ethical journalism. And so the bottom line of our approach is that news doesn't happen in a newsroom. And I once told my editor, if I come back here reeking of marijuana after covering a community meeting, that's how you know I'm doing my job. Now, I'm certainly not suggesting that you folks here need to consume cannabis to know what you're doing. You're much more qualified and have many more letters after your name than I ever will. But I would call on all of us in this space to broaden our perspectives, to engage with new communities, to get out of our silos, and to be brave enough to ask, what effect is my work having? How is it changing the narrative? Because narratives shape policy, and policy shapes lives. And that's something that I'm going to discuss on Wednesday. I have a lunch and learn session, and would be honored if you join me for that. But the point is, we can no longer hide behind the shield of narrow-minded, blinders-on objectivity, because that's not actually objective. It's exclusionary, and it's been damaging. And so that's why we're all here today, I hope, which is to broaden our perspectives, to learn, to teach, to be curious, and to care. So now I'm going to abruptly transition from this high-minded rhetoric to a few housekeeping notes. So one very important thing, I want to make sure everyone knows that the keynote sessions and as well as some of the breakouts are going to be videotaped this week. If for any reason you're not comfortable with that, you don't want to appear on camera, please just identify yourself to one of the summit coordinators in the room and they'll do everything they can to make sure you're still able to attend. Second, we have lunch and learn sessions every day at 12:15, and you'll have a 15-minute break during which you can grab a boxed lunch and head off to the session that you've chosen to attend. There will be seats, there will be tables, so you can eat comfortably and listen at the same time. And just wanted to implore you to stay in the building during those blocks, because really, if you don't, you might miss some of the best stuff we've got this week. And if I find anyone wandering outside without a hall pass, there will be discipline. And finally, many of our sessions are going to have a question and answer section. And so my plea, having been at conferences before, and I'm sure some of you have experienced this, is that when you're an audience member, please ask a concise question rather than launching into a presentation of your own. We just want to make sure everyone has a chance to ask. We want everyone to have a chance to participate. You can always apply to the next one. And so with that, it is my pleasure to introduce to you our keynote speaker this morning, Shaleen Title. So Shaleen Title, for those of you who don't know, is one of the Cannabis Control Commissioners in Massachusetts. She was appointed jointly by the Governor, Treasurer, and Attorney General to serve on the social justice seat of that agency. I can't be too glowing because she is the subject of my coverage, so sorry, Shaleen. But Commissioner Title really has a unique station in cannabis because she has served in nearly every aspect of it. She has been an attorney who's worked on this. She has been a business person, an entrepreneur, and she has been an activist for a long, long time, starting out with SSDP and moving on to the campaigns in Colorado and Massachusetts. And she has served on the national boards of Students for Sensible Drug Policy, Marijuana Majority, Cannabis Law and Family Alliance, and the National Lawyers Guild. And she now, again, is one of the Cannabis Control Commissioners in Massachusetts. So it's my pleasure to introduce to you Commissioner Shaleen Title.
Good morning. Good morning. I already knew this was one of the most well-organized conferences I've ever been to. This is definitely the first time I have been early to a time slot, so this is a good start. I really want to thank AHP, and especially Linda Frazier, Neil Schiffman, and Jane Allen for this invitation to a conference that I had never heard of, and frankly, when I did hear about it, it sounded too good to be true. The fact that it's an elegant and simple idea doesn't take away from the incredible amount of work that it takes to facilitate a space for, not a debate, but a conversation among diverse people, and most importantly, the experts and the decision makers, and with special attention being paid this year to discuss equity and to include the communities most affected by the decisions being made. As a longtime activist for cannabis legalization and racial and social justice before I became a regulator, it feels especially appropriate to be having this conversation in Los Angeles, of course, one of the biggest and most influential cannabis markets in the world, and along with Massachusetts, one of the first jurisdictions to have a cannabis equity program and to be committed to it, despite how challenging it is. I was actually here at this exact hotel, the Westin Bonaventure, in 2011 for the Drug Policy Alliance International Conference. I had just left a new career as a tax lawyer to join the legalization movement. I was listening to all the panels. I was like, maybe I'll be on a panel in one of these rooms one day. And it seemed like our dream of sensible, health-focused policies might come true someday if we fought hard enough and if maybe somebody powerful would listen. Back then, things were very black and white, especially to the rest of the world. Everything was framed as pro-pot or anti-pot. Either you're a crazy weed lover or you're a reefer-mad prohibitionist. And then 2012 happened, and then 2014, and 2016, and 2018. And as legalization became a reality, a lot more complicated questions have been raised. And so to be back here 8 years later, I feel like it's a great time to say, let's throw out the pro-pot versus anti-pot paradigm right here. Because as I see it, there's a whole new goal and struggle. And the solution is way more complex than just getting someone powerful to flip a switch. It's about all of us using whatever voice and whatever resources we have in the fight for who will control this new world. Money, power, and fear, or science, justice, and collaboration? I don't think I'm using this. Can you still hear me?
Yep.
Okay. So let's get right to the question that I know some of you are thinking. The point of this conference is to be neutral and objective. So what does a legalization activist know about being neutral and objective? I'll start by telling you the same thing that I say in interviews, which is 100% true, which is I am adamantly for legalization. So not arresting people for possession, for personal growing, I'm for regulated tax product sales. But beyond that, I don't have an agenda. I think it's about what science shows and what data shows. I don't have an agenda for what should be in a public awareness campaign, or precisely what a serving size should be, or how tall a plant needs to be before it gets a tag. These are things where we've looked at the data available and made a decision. And once you take legalization as a given, you can put smart, diverse people together and make an evidence-based decision on any of those things. I don't see a pro-pot or anti-pot or a pro-legalization or anti-legalization stance on any of those questions. So that's my sincere answer for when I'm asked about that and when I want to be well-behaved. But I was asked to do this keynote to be real. And so I'm going to keep it 100, as they say, and I'm going to go a little further and add something that a lot of people of color in particular, feel about these words, neutral and objective, as they relate to drugs, people who use drugs, and drug laws. So I think most people, if you're here and you have some expertise, you're aware that marijuana became illegal not because of public health concerns, but to advance a racist agenda in which to build support for prohibition, officials waged a public campaign, run the 30s, arguing that Mexican and Black people specifically threatened the nation's stability through sexual promiscuity and violence caused by marijuana use. Fewer people know that according to an article in the California Law Review, there were also claims that California Hindus, who were not actually Hindus but were in fact Sikh Punjabis who had recently begun immigrating to California, were using cannabis or Indian hemp and specifically spreading it to whites. If you skip to when the war on drugs was waged in the 1960s and 1970s, language had begun to shift away from openly racist words, and it was more technically race neutral but dog whistles that were used as code to drum up support for the war on drugs. According to President Nixon's advisor, John Ehrlichman, he said later, something that I try to remember every time the process for economic justice gets overwhelming. He said, "We knew that by getting the public to associate the hippies with marijuana and blacks with heroin, and then criminalizing both heavily, we could disrupt those communities, we could arrest their leaders, raid their homes, break up their meetings, and vilify them night after night on the evening news. Did we know we were lying about those drugs? Of course we did." So in this context, when I hear neutral and objective, I think of a couple things. First, those sanitized clinical words paint a picture that we're starting from zero, creating drug policy with no sense of history beyond, at best, the data that it's produced. But for anyone who has been tangled up in the legal system over a possession charge, or has a loved one who couldn't get a job because of a felony record for small-time pot dealing, or who has lost years of life in a cage for crimes that only seem to get enforced against people of color, our drug laws are a deeply emotional issue, and they should be. I occasionally hear people say, let's just take all the emotion out of it and have a rational conversation. Well, if you don't understand why there's emotion, then you're missing the context that you need to have a rational conversation. Second, culture changes over time in terms of what is acceptable to say. But the constant is that neutral and objective and serious tends to be associated with people with certain privilege, and I'm one of them. It's easy to dismiss Henry Ansinger's remarks because probably it could never happen today. But Let's just understand that was less than 100 years ago on the floor of the US Senate that he said cannabis should be illegal because black men use it to seduce white women on the floor of the US Senate, and senators found that persuasive, and they probably would have described it as neutral and objective. So how can we act like that doesn't matter? How can we pretend like that has passed and doesn't have an impact on what goes on today, and that we have no role in fixing that? Sometimes just by virtue of privilege that you have, anything that you say is considered neutral and objective, whether or not you're intending to use that privilege. And so, as you move through this conference and these sessions, if you start to feel inspired, I hope you do, and you're looking for ways to contribute to equity, I encourage you to stop and double check sometimes. When you are questioning something or you're putting forth an opinion, are you maybe unconsciously taking advantage of that privilege that you have, being considered neutral, objective? Are you putting forth a reasonable, serious man or woman spin on something, when in fact maybe you could make that opinion or that question or that statement more multifaceted and informed by bringing in other voices? And I'm not even talking about Henry Anslinger type remarks. I'm talking about everyday remarks, everyday opinions, especially when you're talking about people who use drugs. You might be sharing something that's stigmatizing. Maybe if you talk to someone from another perspective or from the community you're talking about, it will be even more informed. I'm a very strong believer in meeting people where they're at, and if that's all you take away from this morning, that's fine. That is good. And it is imminent that I'll be sitting there listening to a talk at some point in this conference, and you'll need to meet me where I'm at. And that's fine, because we all came from different places, but we're all here now. That's what matters. And I'm not saying you shouldn't use these words, neutral and objective, by the way. I use them all the time. They are useful words and a concept that almost always represents good intentions. But I propose just that, starting right now at this conference, instead of thinking of neutral and objective as meaning starting from zero, we think of neutral as acknowledging the past, especially our role and our institutions' roles, preferably without judgment, just acknowledgement and building that into what comes next. Who wants to start? I'm going to start. I could talk about the role of Massachusetts, the Massachusetts government, in disproportionate spirit of all of us taking this definition of neutral and objective seriously. I'm going to admit that as a whole, I think the marijuana legalization movement is guilty of often framing things in a way that implicitly reinforces some of the troublesome concepts of marijuana prohibition. What do I mean by that? The California Law Review article I mentioned earlier, which is called White Individualism in Marijuana Legalization Campaigns, an article I highly recommend, is basically a paper that calls out several legalization campaigns, including Colorado, which I worked on, Washington, Oregon, and Alaska, for putting forth messages and images that suggest that white, hardworking, middle-class marijuana consumers are deserving beneficiaries of legalized marijuana, which the author terms white exceptionalism, and that by perpetuating this, we perpetuate those same harms and double standards that have led to the well-known racial disparities in the war on drugs. So implicitly, it sends a message that different people deserve different consequences for the same actions. So the article gives an example. There's an ad that was run by the Colorado campaign in 2012, which I remember very well. A good friend of mine who was a fellow staffer on the campaign did the voiceover for this ad. It came out on Father's Day. And it features a young white man sitting in a park writing a letter that says, "Dear Dad, you know how you enjoy a drink after work? Well, in many ways, I'm just like you. I have a good job, I work hard, but when I get home, I prefer to relax with marijuana." According to the paper, this message signals notions of individual merit, hard work, individual responsibility, and white exceptionalism. There was a similar ad around Mother's Day where a young white woman says she feels safer around marijuana users, which the article implicitly says is an effort to assuage white anxiety about racialized bad others associated with marijuana. And then, here's the kicker for me, the article goes on to say that these types of framings have tended to correlate with policies that favor white marijuana entrepreneurs, which is precisely the biggest problem that I deal with on a day-to-day basis, which started in the early legalization states and has since persisted. I know for sure that there was no ill intent in creating those ads, but I have to acknowledge it and ask, what if those ads had been different? What might look different today? And so I tell you this story to show you that everyone has been a part of this system in one way or the other. And it's really easy to get defensive. When I first read that law review article when it came out, I had a moment like, this kid had no idea what he's doing. He didn't know what prohibition was like. We could have lost Colorado. He didn't know how tough it was. I have a lot of pride and I have a lot of respect for my colleagues. And there, like I said, there was no ill intent. But I tried going back with acknowledgement and no judgment and no blame, frankly because I was trying to think of a good example for this presentation. And I can neutrally look at what happened and say that for future legalization campaigns, if they have a focus on racial justice and social justice from the get-go, that may be correlated with more fair and more inclusive policies, which is exactly what we tried to do in Massachusetts. So let me tell you a little bit about Massachusetts. One question I get a lot is, how did you get to this position? Sometimes asked innocently and sometimes with the subtext of, who the hell made you a commissioner? The answer is in a series of decisions made by the Massachusetts legislature to make the agency that controls cannabis as independent, transparent, and accountable as possible. When the legislature changed the original ballot initiative in 2017, they made the Cannabis Control Commission a new independent agency with 5 members and added specific areas that the person who should be appointed to each seat should have: public safety, public health, business, government regulation, and social justice. When I got the call inviting me to apply for that last seat, I thought maybe they were mixing me with somebody else, or they forgot to check my Twitter, or somebody was about to get fired. But surprisingly, that's not what happened. After thoughtful and honestly enjoyable interviews with each of them, I got the call the day before the announcement that the state treasurer, attorney general, and governor were jointly appointing me to serve on the commission. That's another check, by the way, that the legislature put in to make sure that the selections are never controlled by just one office. It's under 3 different offices. So before the 5 of us met, we learned about each other through the newspaper when the announcements were made. And one of the first things that was announced was that, based on questions from the press, I was the only one of the 5 who had voted yes to legalize marijuana. And there were headlines like, opponents of marijuana selected to control marijuana board. The truth, however, turned out to be a lot more nuanced. Steve Hoffman, who's the chairman of the commission and a former Bain executive who worked with Mitt Romney, surprised all of us at his first ever press conference when he described how he had gone to Colorado the previous year and bought a joint on the 4th of July and smoked it before he watched the fireworks. And my other 3 colleagues, Commissioner Doyle, who had helped to run the medical marijuana program, Commissioner Flanagan, who's a former state senator, is a leader in mental health and substance abuse, and Commissioner McBride, who, in addition to her public safety expertise, led foreclosure prevention for homeowners and jail diversion for veterans, were all a lot more nuanced. And what we ended up with, thank goodness, was not a commission of me and 4 prohibitionists. Instead, we have 5 people with different views and valuable experiences who were all committed to promptly implementing that law. We've disagreed, sometimes sharply, over which direction to take on specific issues. But pulling the emergency brake, delaying, or taking an easy way out has never been on the table. We're doing this, and each of the 5 commissioners has worked hard toward that end, and I can't praise the people who appointed us enough for finding 5 diverse people who are able to think critically and reasonably. Although it's not always easy for any of us to work with 4 other people who are completely different from us, I strongly believe that it has led to better decisions. Much like how studies show diverse juries make better decisions because they exchange more information and consider a broader range of facts more thoroughly before making a decision, so has our commission had to be more thorough in our evaluation and policy making by having to discuss and defend our positions with 4 people from 4 different backgrounds. By the way, that's what I love about this conference as well. It's not just researchers, it's not just clinicians, prevention experts, state officials, it's all of us. And of course this year, there's the emphasis on people from the different communities that we're trying to benefit. And I think in the same way, making that space for all of us to be in a conversation together makes the quality of this conference better. Another thing that makes the process in Massachusetts fun and better, that it also has in common with this conference, is the conversations are public. We have a uniquely strict open meeting law that does not allow the majority of our commission, so 3 people, to have a conversation about anything substantive. So that means when we were first appointed, we only had 5 people, we were in 5 cubicles in borrowed space, and we couldn't talk about anything except like the weather until we got into a table on a stage like this, and we had to be like, hey, so we have this whole industry to regulate, you guys want to like split it up? And have that whole conversation with TV cameras in our face. It was really hard, but we got used to it, and it's all for the better because the public gets to watch us have every licensing and policy and every other substantive conversation truly from scratch, and understand where the decision came from. Even when it sometimes gets awkward, like at our last meeting when one of the applicants had listed that they were planning to make moon rocks, and I knew that was a cannabis product, but I couldn't remember what it was. And one of my colleagues thought it was candy, but she wasn't sure if she was thinking of pop rocks or moon rocks. And we had to have this whole discussion in public. But everybody knew exactly what we were thinking. We have expert advisory groups, and I think that leads to better decision making as well. We have a whole list of 25 people with expertise in everything from cultivation, manufacturing, retail, to public safety, to minority business ownership, substance abuse, civil rights, social justice, the whole gamut, and the group is really diverse and meets in public too. So you see things like at one of the last meetings that they had, the patient representative was explaining to the commissioner of the Department of Agriculture what a quartz nail is for dabbing. It's a very unusual group of people having conversations that you probably would never see at any other table. But it makes our decisions better, and it's really important, I think, for us to have humility and know that we can't be experts in everything, and so we rely on advisory groups. And that brings me to another element of what I think is the real meaning of neutral and objective, which I know a lot of you share, and that's the willingness and even eagerness to be challenged. So I promise I won't make this a commercial for Massachusetts, but I do want to tell you about our research agenda. When the legislature decided to expand upon the law that voters passed in 2016, they included a specific mandate for the research agenda for adult use cannabis. In particular, to understand the social and economic trends of marijuana in the Commonwealth, inform decisions that aid in the elimination of the illicit market, I would have said minimize, and inform decisions on the public health impacts of marijuana. So we have started building out a research team that's led by our research director, Dr. Julie Johnson. In collaboration with the Department of Public Health, we launched a statewide public awareness campaign that focuses on youth prevention and responsible consumption, informed by 18 focus groups that were conducted throughout the state last year. And we've begun to collaborate with state agencies, academics, think tanks, and other researchers to examine other research items. Dr. Johnson presented to the Commission several months ago about her plan to connect diverse stakeholders that are authorized to conduct high-quality, impactful studies, which will help us to monitor the effects of Massachusetts marijuana laws. And the department recently issued a report on impaired driving, which is available on our website, masscannabiscontrol.com. And I encourage all of you to take advantage of that research, which is for the public benefit, and particularly people in other states who are trying to make decisions. On that note, we also recently concluded an RFR process to identify a company to create our business intelligence and open data solution to ensure that all of this information that our agency and the people of Massachusetts have isn't just sitting on a computer in our government offices, but rather open to everyone to find insights and hold us accountable, and for all other government agencies to use to make informed decisions. And so the private sector can make better decisions too. So keep an eye on the commission to make sure that you have access to that data warehouse as well. I want to highlight 6 areas where I'm particularly proud of how we use data in our decision making. The first 3 I relied heavily on my colleagues with expertise in those areas, and I know there are experts here who will be going into great detail on those topics. But I can say that I'm really proud of the way that we used experience from other states, particularly in terms of what our public awareness campaign looked like. And in other areas, we were bold. Environmental regulations were one of the areas where I believe we were the first, or one of the first states, to put limits on our licensees, and we're keeping close track of that and making sure that information is available for everyone. The last 3 were policies that I led. Our earlier definition of neutral and objective acknowledged the role of the past. So in that vein, our diversity plan, positive impact plan, and our social equity program are a way to include communities disproportionately harmed in the legal industry as required by our legal mandate. We'll be digging into that today at a Lunch and Learn session with Kat Packer, who's the Executive Director of the LA Department of Cannabis Regulation. So if you're interested in talking about what a social equity program looks like interactively, I encourage you to come to that session. The diversity plan is just a way to allow / force our licensees to benefit from the inherent benefits of having diversity. So they have to submit to us, how will you include all these different populations? How will you measure how you are going towards your own goals that you've named? And then we make sure that they're following it. And then lastly, the positive impact plan is how they contribute in their own same creative, innovative methods that they bring to everything else to helping disproportionately impacted communities. So we've seen things like career fairs, incubators, accelerators, sometimes it's just giving to charity. They're all over the map, but the point is to help them look at the culture of their own organization and make their own impact that they can be proud of. If I could oversimplify for a minute and paint with a very broad brush, many of you who have or would vote against legalization, we might have been on opposite sides before. But I believe we have a common goal through a common adversary, and it's on the slide. If I can oversimplify again, I'll say that the people of Massachusetts, as well as the legislature and state government, are generally unified in wanting the cannabis business to be diverse and characterized by people of all backgrounds, farmers, veterans, people of color, small local businesses, minority women-owned businesses, and co-ops and micro-businesses in particular, and not so much big out-of-state companies. But that has proved very challenging for complex reasons that I would boil down to, if I had to do it in one sentence, rigorous barriers to entry and market requirements that demand large amounts of capital, unreasonably large amounts of capital. And thus, despite our best intentions and best efforts, we favor the already privileged and essentially encourage big marijuana. I was recently reading about the filings from a couple weeks ago from a lawsuit where Attorney General Maura Healey, the Attorney General from Massachusetts, is suing the Sackler family behind Purdue Pharma. I will tell A.G. Healy, she got a round of applause. Alleging that they had misled doctors and patients about OxyContin's risk, leading to more patients on higher doses for long periods, and influencing predatory deregulation, with this quote from the launch party, where Mr. Sackler allegedly spoke of a blizzard of prescriptions, saying, "The prescription blizzard will be so deep, dense, and white." And as the evidence showed, there was starting to be a problem with overdoses. There was a distinct effort to blame the people who had become addicted, with an email saying, "We have to hammer on abusers in every way possible. They are the culprits and the problem. They are reckless criminals." Reminds me of the quotes that I read from the beginning. I don't have an example yet of a marijuana company that acts this way, but I believe that there are some lots that are trying. I can't speak for anyone else, but I have no interest in arguing that that wouldn't happen because marijuana is different from OxyContin. Of course it's different, the risks are different, the harms are different, but ultimately when something is being commercialized, there's a profit motive, a different one than under prohibition, but a profit motive nonetheless. And now that legalization is here, and by most accounts here to stay, and the industry has stood up, it's about utilizing this crucial early period to make bold, data-driven decisions to create the best industry that we can. And like most of you, I'm sure, I'm concerned about the data that an estimated 80% of the volume of cannabis is consumed by an estimated 20% of the users, which is where the profits lie. That, as many of the experts in this room will detail over the conference, I'm sure, there will be attempts to create new heavy users. And I can also confirm, and this will surprise no one, that there are strong efforts toward market domination and consolidation, and to lift license limits where they exist, like in Massachusetts. We collect baseline demographic data of licensees and employees, and we release them at every meeting, and the lack of diversity is dismal, as it is throughout the country. And some would say, if you take all of this together, a major course correction here is needed. So, here's what I think about this. From my perspective, the problems that we face now, in particular the shocking lack of representation and inclusion in the legal cannabis industry that the activist movement helped shape, are the inevitable results of crafting policies whose fundamental purpose was to appease people who were afraid of the unknown. But we are starting to have some knowns. And if we want to have an industry we can be proud of, we must start asking the question, whom are we protecting and from what? For example, we test the product to protect people who use it from contaminants. We have serving sizes to protect from having an inconsistent experience. But if we can't answer this question, then we need to consider not making that decision. Because the regulatory regimes that have been built on top of that initial foundation of fear inherently favor the already privileged. Their endless restrictions and requirements mean an unreasonable amount of capital is required to start a compliant business. I'll give you a couple of examples. So in Massachusetts, there is a lot of local control for cities and towns to choose basically however many and whoever they are licensees. And there has been a much greater advantage, I think by all accounts, to people who are politically connected. That is not based on science. The fact that there's often no transparency to that process is not based on science. There is very tight zoning and other land use restrictions that confer a massive head start to those who can readily outbid competitors for prime properties and buildings. So I've seen this happen in my own city, that experts will say, okay, under the state law, default is 500 feet away from K through 12 schools. And other decision makers will say 500, like it's an auction, let's make it 600. Another will say, let's make it 700. That's not based on science, and what people don't realize is as you make the available properties fewer and fewer, you are favoring the already connected and the inherently wealthy, and that is not based on science. Where they exist, arbitrarily capped licensing systems, 5 licenses here, 10 licenses there, with no acknowledgement of the past and no transparent process for selection, inevitably grant what they themselves refer to as golden tickets, monopolies to a handful of well-capitalized firms that will likely go on to shamelessly exploit their workers and the environment. That is not based on science. For those whose communities were savaged by arrests for marijuana crimes that never should have been crimes, these excessive regulatory barriers are a non-starter. But for the well-networked and the wealthy, these barriers to entry are little more than a 2-foot-high baby gate, an inconvenience easily stepped over with a boost from, and I've seen them, a small army of top-shelf lawyers, lobbyists, business advisors, security consultants, and so on. I think people with unlimited resources love these barriers to entry because they keep competitors out. Such regulatory regimes are a recipe for making a reality of the thing that I think anti-legalization advocates are right to fear, and that's big marijuana. We don't need to look hard to find examples of massive corporations from Altria to Coca-Cola who are eyeing the space. And keeping prohibition in place certainly isn't the answer. The answer is science and collaboration over fear. And that means I have a lot of work to do. I have a lot of sessions to attend, notes to take, papers to read, follow-up questions to ask many of you, and the willingness that sometimes I'm going to hear something that challenges my current thinking and to accept that, and I will. So when we rely on conventional wisdom with its roots in prohibition, rather than on data, then we end up with these policies that favor the most well-resourced and well-connected and ignore the vulnerable among us. I say we need to say goodbye to that paradigm. The question is no longer, are we pro versus anti-pot? That dichotomy is out of date, and the longer we stick to it, the more it will be taken advantage of. There's a book I found particularly inspiring lately called Winners Take All by Anand Giridharadas, whose thesis is that powerful people and companies who claim to change the world are often just co-opting the language of social change while digging in and protecting their profits and the system that helps them as much as ever. I find it resonating because for an activist, there is nothing more infuriating than someone pretending to use the ideas that you believe in to buy themselves business. Or in the case of at least one ballot initiative, a monopoly on marijuana production for 10 investor groups who donated $10 million each to the campaign. That was the campaign that failed spectacularly, by the way. But it does resonate because there are investor groups, often with former politicians who oversaw the arrest of mass numbers of people for marijuana, who are now using our language of social justice to buy themselves a share in this market. Okay, but what's different is what Anand largely focuses on in his book is the tech industry, people who say that they're changing the world, but they're not, or the pharmaceutical industry, something that's well established. He uses the Sackler family a lot in his examples with their philanthropic work, but the cannabis industry is not established yet. What if we course corrected, and we have to together talk through what this means, but what if we, the scientific and research and public health and government and activism communities, collectively refuse to hand over this industry to a small group of companies who wish to extract as much profits as possible and extract from the people and the users and the environment and either give nothing back or worse, donate to a few substance abuse programs or equity programs and co-opt our social justice language? What if we just said no? So I propose instead that this next wave of legalization focuses on the most vulnerable among us. I want to go through a few examples that I'll take my share of blame on behalf of a movement that I think largely ignored these issues for the sake of political convenience. First of all, marijuana is only legal for some of us. When those of us who are at a desk job that don't get drug tested can use it, but people who get drug tested and get fired for use weeks ago that has nothing to do with impairment on the job, it's not fair for them. One great story about collaboration real quick is that my state senator, Senator Jason Lewis, was one of the primary opponents of legalization in Massachusetts, and we had been on opposite sides of debates multiple times during the campaign. And his big thing was big marijuana. And once I got appointed and the law passed and I went to see him, we talked about it, and we both are sincere in our beliefs that now that legalization has passed, we want this to be done right. So now we're collaborating, and Senator Lewis has introduced a bill in Massachusetts called Bernadette Bill, which is named after Bernadette Hoffman, who is a woman, I think she's a grandmother, and she said she vaped once at night because she had an injury, and it never affected her work, and she got fired. And she said that was not fair. She was very loud about it, and now there's a bill to help people like her. Secondly, impaired driving enforcement has to focus on impairment. I don't think that needs to be explained any further. Third, in Massachusetts, localities have to document under the law what the costs imposed on the municipality are. If there's any more police detail, if there's traffic issues, whatever needs to be paid for by the business has to be documented. And in the future, we'll have real costs based on real data. We can use that to make decisions. Everyone should have legal access and a place to consume. This is another issue where, in reality, marijuana is only legal for some people, for homeowners, because if you're in public housing or if you're in an apartment and your landlord doesn't let you use it, and we don't have social consumption facilities available yet, essentially it's not legal for you. And last but not least, business licensing should be fair and affordable, with room for businesses of all sizes. So the question is, how do we inform the law with research and data in order to promote fairness, justice, and businesses with values we can be proud of? How do we stop the forthcoming threats of big marijuana and everything that it represents? If we want to do that, it's up to the next generation of leaders, everyone in this room, to create a new age of honesty and collaboration. We have the tools to do it. We just need the will. And the way we can do this is to follow the science. Our director of research, Dr. Julie Johnson, said, follow the science first and let society and policy digest. So with that, I extend my hand to you for us working together for a coming wave of legalization that must be grounded in an entirely new framework, an evidence-based framework based on a clear-eyed recognition of the racist history of the war on drugs, real fairness, real neutrality, real objectivity, and respect and dignity for all communities. Thank you very much for your time. Here is our website, and you can follow the commission on Twitter. You can follow me personally on Twitter. I'm very active, always happy to get in discussions or answer questions. And I think we have time for a couple questions. Thank you.
All right, thank you again. Let's give it up for Commissioner Title.
So we'd like to take some questions from folks. I think maybe, why don't we have folks maybe form a line over here so that Commissioner Title can hear you, and while we get the mic situation straightened out. So if folks want to queue up over here, and I'll come down and we'll have Commissioner Title answer some questions for you.
So my name is Stan Glantz. I fight big tobacco, and I would be interested in how you would operationalize a regulatory environment that would keep big marijuana from developing while protecting the other industries.
So the question was, how would you operationalize an environment that kept big marijuana out while protecting the things you were talking about? You said you work on big tobacco. I would look to experts like you. I mean, that's why I'm here. That's why I said this. I do know that in Massachusetts, we have an issue with not receiving applications from the communities that we're trying to prioritize. And it's easy to say we know exactly what the issues are. You know, it's lack of capital, it's lack of business expertise. But I don't think we should guess at that. So we're in the process of doing a study with focus groups, with narrative interviews to get information on what we can do to help those communities. So that's where I would start. But certainly we don't want to reinvent the wheel. We want to take lessons from big tobacco and from other groups. So I would look to you.
Is this on? Yes. So as an educator, I'm interested, from California, interested in safety of youth and animals and elderly. And you didn't mention anything that I heard about accidental consumption. And I want to know what you're doing in Massachusetts about that.
Yeah, so I have a 5-year-old. He likes to pick things up and try them. I think accidental consumption is something where if it even happens once, that's too many times. The measures that we've taken in Massachusetts have been largely based on input from public health experts and from other states. So we don't allow things that look like gummy bears, that look like animals, that look like fruits. We don't allow things that are attractive to children. We don't allow colloquial references to marijuana and logos. So that's where we are now. We also have that public awareness campaign that encourages people who are using marijuana or a possession of it to make sure that it's locked up, and that's the law as well. So that's where we're focusing at the moment. Certainly we're keeping a close eye on it. If there's an issue, we'll address it directly, but thankfully so far there hasn't been.
Hi, I'm from Canada, and I like your notion that big cannabis maybe isn't established yet. I'm not so sure that's true. There's some really large corporations that are heavily invested, so I think that ship has sailed. And so, if you will indulge me, given that I believe big cannabis is here and established, and I agree it would have been great if that hadn't happened, what can we do to mitigate the risks of that information, that balanced message not getting to the public, as we've seen with tobacco, we've seen with opioids? Certainly the science is important, but if those important lessons and information arising from science that warns us of risk are being communicated, that is, I think, what we need to protect the public from. I think informed choice is really important. So what can we do as the very quiet counter voice to a very large big cannabis machine that has its message? What can we do collectively, collaboratively, to ensure that the public does have a balanced message?
That's a great question, and it's another collaborative question, I think. And certainly whether big marijuana is here or not is a term of art. And in Canada, it's probably different from the United States. I think that the federal status here probably contributes to what I describe as not being established yet. So what can we do collaboratively? I think it's a combination of two things. I think one, we should use our ability as regulators to regulate these businesses robustly. We should make sure they're not doing the things that we described from that court filing, and if they are, there should be consequences. Certainly that's why we have advertising restrictions, purchase restrictions, and we would look to other industries to see what we can do to keep from more heavy users from being created. So that's the first part, is how we interact with the licensees and the business. And then secondly is our role as government protecting all people is to make sure that people who need information and people who need help or treatment have access to that.
So just very quickly, two things I want to mention. One, I should have said when folks, if you come up to the mic, if you could just say who you are and the organization you represent. I think that would be helpful for everybody. And secondly, just to steal a little of your thunder and partially answer the previous question, I think one thing that the people in the research and prevention community should do is reach out to the press.
If you want to communicate to the public these messages, if you want to counteract the messages that are coming from the industry, engage proactively with media. Figure out who in your area is covering cannabis. Generally, reporters, their contact information is not hard to find. And pitch us stories. Write a critique of a story we already wrote. We welcome that kind of feedback. Thank you.
Patrick Oglesby, Center for New Revenue. When it comes to economic justice, a model that has worked for the years in sharing the wealth is the state store model, the government monopoly model. Now we've got that for alcohol in our U.S. states, we've got it for cannabis in Canada, in some of the provinces, and in North Montreal, Washington, the state of Louisiana. What would you say to folks about that model as they're looking to try to share the wealth?
I support it. I'm very interested to see what happens in Canada and those jurisdictions. I think that the reason that it didn't happen in the US is because it was led not by legislators but by ballot initiatives that needed to be funded. And now that we do have legislators working to pass programs, I would love to see that.
Good morning. Thank you for your talk. Valerie Yerger, University of California, San Francisco. I'm also co-founder of the African American Tobacco Control Leadership Council. I authored a resolution through my sorority, Delta Sigma Theta sorority, which is the largest Black female organization in the world, waking up the sorority to the issue of menthol cigarettes. And have worked with Carol Magruder in waking this issue up among the NAACP. So I happen to know that the NAACP is very interested in this issue. I'm very curious to know if anyone from the NAACP is here. This is California. They help support Proposition 64, not necessarily because they wanted people to pick up smoking marijuana, but because of the criminalization issue. So if we're talking about connecting and engaging with communities, I'm just wondering, was there an effort to get those communities like the NAACP here? And if you guys are here, can you reach out to myself and to Carol Magruder?
That's a great point. I'll just add in Massachusetts, those working groups that I mentioned on impaired driving and the advisory board, they do include Boston and Massachusetts and AACP, and I think they've been a really important voice.
My name is Barbara Herbert, and I'm a practicing physician. I'm here not mentioning any of the places where I practice, but part of Grace Street Group because of the dangers of people losing insurance coverage. I believe that marijuana lives somewhere between alcohol and aspirin. And being a doctor, I'm sort of on the aspirin side. So I think that I've certainly seen among my chronic pain patients, and particularly among poorer and more impaired people, real benefits that can come from marijuana. But the capacity for them to get access to doctors interested is severely impaired by the fact that we can't use their insurance. So I would just like to say, when we talk about health equity, I don't think it's just about creating spaces where people can buy marijuana, but it's about a range of capacity so that we can use it in effective ways when an insurance base isn't possible. Do you have any ideas about how we can set up a program for, say, elder women of color in Dorchester who are in terrible pain, who would benefit?
You're absolutely right. That's another thing I would welcome collaboration from experts on, but I know in my experience it's been probably 15 years that I've steadily seen underground groups where patients are helping other patients, sometimes forming cooperatives. In Massachusetts, you can freely give away product that you grow up to a certain amount. So I think it's collaboration among patients and protecting their legal right to do that.
But also we have now expertise about different chemovars and paradoxical reactions and things that ordinarily in science we would bring forward, primarily probably through the federally qualified health centers, but we have no engagement between those kind of clinical experts and the patients, and there's no profit motive to make it happen. So I'm particularly concerned about that.
What state did you say you're in?
Massachusetts.
Let's talk offline.
And by the way, when it comes to solving the insurance problem, write your congressman or woman.
Good morning. My name is Lynn Silver. I'm a pediatrician and director of Getting It Right from the Start project at the Public Health Institute in California. I very much appreciated your statement that we need a major course correction. I was one who clapped over there, but and I ask, how do we build the energy to create that major course correction? I think in several areas, but key areas are one, building equity in licensing and taking it out of the hands of major investors. But secondly, creating an understanding that legalization does not mean anything goes. That legalization does not mean you can produce any conceivable marijuana product that an industry can imagine, even if it's 95% THC. That it does not mean that we can shift the entire agricultural production of marijuana from 3% THC to 30% THC or 20%, as is occurring today, with likely devastating impacts on health, on high school graduation, on addiction. Our regulatory bodies, in the interests of facilitating the transition to the legal market, rather than just facilitating the transition of what was already sold, are facilitating the growth of an enormous industrial infrastructure that is multiplying the number of harmful products, potent products, strawberry, banana pre-rolls, all the kinds of things that we've been trying to prohibit from tobacco, and marketing them aggressively. So how do we create a new culture of cannabis regulation that is not anything goes? And if you want to hear more about that, come to our breakout this morning.
That's an excellent point. I don't know if this is the same in other states, but in Massachusetts, we've had a significant number of public feedback hearings and public feedback period and hearings. And I would love to hear more feedback from experts on that, specifically the products and how they should be managed and what the limits should be. And we haven't gotten much for some reason. I don't know if it's the same way in other states, but if you have opinions on that, even if you're not in Massachusetts, my contact information's up there. I really welcome it.
Thank you. It's time to wake up.
Good morning.
Good morning.
My name is David Siwi, and I'm from Quebec. I'm working at Yara Consulting, and we're working with First Nation in Quebec. And I would like to know what is the relations that the state of Massachusetts has with Native Americans in your states, and did you hear about them? What are the relations? How do you deal with them?
That has not been on my radar. I'm going to a panel right after this to find out, as a matter of fact.
Okay, and we are presenting at 10:45 in Laval. So I invite you to come and hear about what we are doing in Quebec province.
Thank you. Thank you. I'll be there. Last question?
I feel privileged. My name is Gilbert Mora. I'm a prevention coordinator in Hollywood and also policy chair at Rethinking Access to Marijuana, an LA County-based coalition. As you may have known, California basically decriminalized marijuana almost 25 years ago with Governor Schwarzenegger. And I don't think the fact that it was decriminalized was understood in the law enforcement agencies and among everybody. What do you think you guys are doing to help law enforcement understand what decriminalization is and the steps they need to be in order so that they're not, quote unquote, just enforcing it on people of color? Because as Colorado shown, they legalized it, but I don't want to sound racist, but the white kids weren't getting caught. It was the black and brown kids that were getting caught, and they were getting caught at a higher rate, whereas the Caucasian kids their rate dropped. So what are we doing in that aspect?
I think we'll stop questions with you if that's okay. So police training is crucial on the law. Our adult use marijuana law lists that as the primary place where tax revenue should go. I think that it's not as clear as a layperson might think when you're looking at what the law is and what's licensed and what is unlicensed. So you need very strong cooperation between the business licensing agency and law enforcement. We see, like I said, we don't have social consumption in Massachusetts yet, so we see a lot of events where it's a safe place for people to consume, but they're charging for a ticket and then they're giving away marijuana. So how do we handle that? And I think that when we collaborate, both on policy and on training for what the law is and ensuring that we're consistent among different communities, that's the key.
All right, thank you. And to your question about reporters, most of them are pro and don't want to hear from public health. And the few times that I did give a thing, they kind of demonized me as like I'm blowing a dog whistle when I was trying to let them know what my actual concerns were.
There are certainly a lot of improvements that we need to make to how the media covers cannabis, and I'm actually involved in an effort to formalize that by having a sort of society of professional cannabis journalists to have a style guide, to have an FAQ and a glossary and resources for media outlets so that they can do a better job covering the subject. But certainly it's disheartening to hear that a professional reporter would get a sincere email from someone who's a real expert in something and be dismissive of it or demonize that person. That's certainly not how we conduct ourselves, and it's not how people should. I think Commissioner Title's done with questions, and did you want to take
We can take the two.
Do you want to take the last two in line? Okay, all right, we'll do the last two questions and we'll move on to our morning sessions.
Thank you, Commissioner, for the great presentation. I'm Alexandra Criticos from Brandeis University. My question is specifically around the marijuana market in Massachusetts. I know that Massachusetts has really recently been up and running in November with recreational marijuana sales, and if I'm correct, during the first week, sales were about $6 million. The commission, the Cannabis Control Commission, has adopted a seed-to-sale tracking system, and I was wondering if we know what are the type of products that people are consuming, because in order to better regulate a market, we need to know what people are consuming. So over the past 3 months, if we have any insight into that.
I don't have that off the top of my head. That probably would be public information. If you want to submit a public records request, we can get it anonymized and send it to you. I know we released the amounts and the average transaction, but I don't know exactly the mix of products.
Hi, Commissioner. Thank you very much. It was very inspiring. I'm Alexis Gosdet, the director of EMCDDA, the European Drugs Agency. I have a question about for Massachusetts and all states in the US where it has been legalized. We find there is a big issue about data collection, monitoring, surveillance, public health. On the internet and publicly, we find much more fake news, wrong interpretations, wrong reports, and I think it is contributing to increasing misunderstanding about what's happening. And again, it's more in favor of big business than public health and public safety. So I would like to know what you are doing in Massachusetts. I would be interested in keeping in contact. Just a comment for your ID. I think it would be good to have such a society, but why only on cannabis? I think it should be about illicit drugs or substance abuse in general. I think it would be very helpful. Thank you.
I'll leave it at that.
Thank you so much, everyone. I think, as you can see from the questions that Commissioner Title received, we have a genuinely diverse group of people here from a genuinely diverse set of backgrounds, and I know that we're all looking forward to sharing our expertise, to learning, to teaching, and so with that, let's get to it. We'll get into our morning sessions shortly. Thank you, everybody.